In the spring of 1882, in a book called The Gay Science, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote a short parable about a madman who runs into a crowded marketplace in the bright light of morning, carrying a lit lantern, shouting again and again, "I seek God! I seek God!" The people in the square don't believe in God either. Plenty of them are proud, comfortable atheists, and they laugh at him. One asks if God is lost. Another asks if he's hiding. A third asks if he's emigrated. The crowd laughs harder. And then the madman turns on them and says the line everyone half remembers and almost nobody reads in context. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Most people who quote that sentence stop right there, as if it were a boast, a triumphant slogan for a new age of reason. Nietzsche wrote the opposite of a boast. He wrote a man in the town square screaming in horror at what the crowd hasn't even noticed it did. Today we're going to walk through Nietzsche's actual parable of the death of God, what he meant by it that has almost nothing to do with a debate about whether God exists, and the real question he leaves standing once the applause for atheism finally stops. It's worth knowing what kind of thinker wrote this, because it changes how you hear it. Nietzsche was the son of a Lutheran pastor, raised in a devout household, trained for years in classical philology and theology before he ever wrote a word of philosophy professionally. He was not an outsider taking a cheap shot at religion he never understood from the inside. He grew up inside the very cathedral he later described as standing empty. He spent the rest of his working life, in increasing physical pain and near total isolation, trying to describe exactly what happens to a civilization when the ceiling it built its whole house under simply isn't there anymore. He did not celebrate that collapse the way people now assume. He dreaded it, and he thought almost nobody around him had noticed it was already happening. 1. The parable, read correctly. Nietzsche wrote the scene with careful, specific staging, and every detail is doing work. The madman arrives in the bright morning hours, lantern lit, searching for something in broad daylight that a lantern is useless for finding. The image of a man still looking, out of old habit, for a light that used to organize the whole sky. Nietzsche wrote, "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers." Notice the pronoun. Not science killed God, not the Enlightenment killed God, not some abstract historical force operating over their heads. You and I. A personal accusation, aimed at everyone standing in that square, including the smug atheists laughing at him, because their comfortable unbelief is exactly the murder weapon he's talking about, and they haven't noticed the blood on their own hands. The madman then asks the questions that actually carry the argument. How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Every image is about removing a fixed point of reference. The sea, the horizon, the sun, the very things you'd use to know which way is up. He isn't asking whether a deity exists somewhere out past the stars. He's describing the sudden loss of the one shared structure that used to tell an entire civilization what mattered, what was true, and which direction was forward. 2. Not a celebration, a diagnosis of vertigo. The next lines are the ones almost never quoted, and they're the actual center of the passage. Nietzsche wrote, "Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space?" This is not an atheist's victory lap. This is vertigo, described with total precision by a writer who understood exactly what was being lost. Picture someone told from childhood that a fixed compass exists, that it always points the same true direction, no matter how lost they feel. Then one day the compass is simply gone, and no one around them will admit it, because most of them are still glancing at their wrist out of habit and reading a needle that isn't there anymore. That's the crowd in the marketplace. They've stopped believing in the compass. They haven't yet noticed they're the ones who threw it away, or that they now have no way to tell which direction they're walking. Nietzsche has the madman ask one more question that lands hardest of all. Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Not, aren't we free now? Not, isn't this progress? A question about an almost unbearable weight that has just landed on ordinary human shoulders with nowhere else to go. 3. Why the crowd doesn't understand him yet. Here's the detail that turns the parable from a scene into an actual argument about how history works. The madman looks at his silent, baffled audience and says, "I have come too early. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men." Then he makes the comparison explicit. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. Light from a dead star can travel toward Earth for centuries after the star itself has already gone out, so that for a long time people keep looking up and seeing a light that isn't actually there anymore, coming from a source that no longer exists. Nietzsche's claim is that the intellectual and cultural death of God had already effectively happened by 1882. Europe's confident secular science, its historical criticism of Scripture, its whole modern habit of explaining the world without appeal to divine causes, had already quietly done the killing. But the consequences of that fact, what it actually costs a civilization to lose its shared foundation, hadn't caught up yet. People were still living by the old light, while the star that made it had already gone dark. 4. The shadow that outlives the God. Nietzsche returns to this exact image a few pages earlier in the same book, in a shorter passage that almost nobody reads alongside the madman scene, and it completes the argument. He wrote, "God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown." A shadow keeps its shape long after the object that cast it is gone, as long as the light source stays in the same place. Nietzsche's claim is specific and uncomfortable. Killing off literal belief in God does nothing, by itself, to remove the structure that belief used to hold up. The assumption that some value, some cause, some idea sits safely above question and criticism, exempt from the same doubt applied to everything else. People who considered themselves thoroughly modern, thoroughly secular, thoroughly done with religion, kept building new cathedrals anyway, around progress, around the nation, around reason itself treated as a kind of infallible priesthood. They called the result freedom, when it was really the same shadow falling across a different wall. Picture someone who's proudly certain they answer to no authority, no tradition, no inherited creed. Then watch them treat their own political side, or their own certainty about how history bends, with exactly the untouchable reverence a believer once reserved for Scripture, unwilling to hear a single word against it, quick to treat disagreement as a kind of heresy rather than an ordinary difference of view. Nothing about the substance changed, only the name on the altar did. Nietzsche's whole point is that the caves are still full of shadow worshippers who think they walked outside into the light, and that noticing your own cave is by far the hardest part of the whole exercise, since a shadow never announces itself as one from the inside. 5. The real question. Not, does God exist, but who lays the new foundation? This is where the video's title actually resolves. The madman's hardest line, "Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" is not rhetorical despair. It's Nietzsche naming the actual task left behind once an old, borrowed foundation collapses, and nobody built a new one to replace it. For centuries, an entire civilization outsourced the hardest question a person can ask: what is actually worth valuing, and why? To an authority everyone agreed to treat as final. That arrangement is now gone, whether anyone in the marketplace has admitted it or not, and Nietzsche's honest answer is that nothing else is coming to replace it automatically. No new voice descends to hand out a fresh, ready-made set of values with the old authority intact. If a foundation gets built at all, a person has to lay it themselves, with their own hands, fully aware that no cosmic guarantee backs the choice. That is exactly the discipline Nietzsche spent the rest of his working life trying to describe. In The Overman, in Amor Fati, in the whole demanding architecture of a self-created value that has to hold its own weight without borrowing it from anywhere else. 6. Two honest reactions to the same collapse. Nietzsche himself doesn't pretend there's only one correct way to feel about this, and the book's other famous passage on the subject proves it. Later in The Gay Science, describing the same event from the opposite emotional angle, he wrote that philosophers and free spirits, on first hearing the news that the old god is dead, might feel illumined by a new dawn, gripped by a sense of a new and scarcely describable kind of light, happiness, relief, exhilaration. He then adds a line that directly answers the marketplace's vertigo with something like its opposite. At last, the horizon appears free to us again. At last, our ships may venture out again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. The horizon, the madman said, was wiped away. The sea, he said, had been drunk dry. Nietzsche brings both images back, deliberately, and turns them into an invitation instead of a wound. Same event, two entirely different honest reactions, and the difference between them isn't which one is correct. It's whether a person is still standing frozen in the marketplace, staring at a wiped horizon with nothing to replace it, or has actually done the harder work of building something able to stand on its own out on that open water. So the parable was never really about whether God exists, and it was never a celebration either. It was Nietzsche watching a civilization casually discard the one structure that used to answer its hardest questions, and realizing almost nobody in the room had noticed the weight that now had nowhere else to land except on them personally. The madman ends his speech by throwing his lantern to the ground, where it breaks and goes out, and declaring that he has come too early. The news hasn't traveled far enough yet to be understood. He then walks into churches he says have become the tombs and sepulchres of God, and sings a requiem for a foundation the crowd is still standing on without realizing it isn't there. The real question was never, is there a God? It was always, now that the old answer is gone, who's actually going to lay the new one? And are you willing to be the one holding the lantern when it finally breaks? If this gave you a clearer way to think about what actually collapsed and what's still left to build, subscribe to Above Average, where we explore the psychology and philosophy of the thinkers who saw what most people never do. Thanks for watching.